I offer these words from Greta Crosby as our call to community. Creator of Earth's merry-go-round of times and seasons, wheeling day and night, birth, growth, fulfillment, descent to rest, and of the seasons of the heart. We would enter into awareness of the inward world shared by our deepest selves. Be with us as we welcome, each in our own way, this high season, spring for awakening, Passover for freedom, Easter for hope against hope, all for love. Will you join Sharon and me with the words for lighting your chalice, which appear on the screen and are in your order of service. Welcoming all free seekers of truth and meaning, we gather to excite the human spirit, to inspire its growth and development, to respond morally and ethically to a troubled world, and to sustain a vital and nurturing religious community.
The Dandelion Seed by Joseph Anthony, illustrated by Chris Arbo. It was autumn in the garden. All the flowers had died and dropped their seeds. Only one seed was left, a little dandelion seed who was afraid to let go. But the winter wind began to blow. The stronger the wind blew, the tighter the seed hung on to it until it felt the wind blowing right through it. Then the seed left the garden behind. It became part of the wind and was carried away. The world was bigger than the seed ever imagined. It was also more frightening, more lonely, and more beautiful. The more the seed saw, the smaller it felt. It wondered where it belonged. The seed landed when the snow began to fall. It listened in silence as peace covered it like a blanket. Finally, spring came. Sunshine warmed the air and the soil, and the little seed began to grow tiny leaves and roots. Its leaves spread wide to gather sunshine. Its roots reached deep to drink fresh rain. Soon the seed flowered into the bright, delicate dandelion it was meant to be. It shared its green leaves with deer and rabbits. It gave sweet nectar to bees and butterflies. Then, almost overnight, the life that began as one little dandelion seed ripened into many. They each became part of the wind and were carried away. All except one. Don't be afraid, whispered the dandelion. The wind and the sun and the rain will take care of you. Let go, and you will see. You will see.
Will you please join me in reading responsively? I just need to see the slide before I give directions. I'm going to read the first part, and I invite you to read the italics. We need a celebration that speaks the spring-inspired word about life and death.
About us as we live and die.
Through all the cycling seasons, days, and years,
we need the sense of gaiety to
and push life out of inner tombs and outer pain.
Unless we move the seasons of self, the spring can come for us.
The winter will go on and on.
And Easter will remain a myth, and life will never come again, despite the fact of spring.
I want to thank again Reverend Linda Hoddy for the sermon, which she wrote. I can't do it in her voice, but I will offer her words. Easter is fraught for UUs. As the young Jewish Christian couple make their way to Easter service at their UU church with parents who have come to celebrate the holiday, the wife, from a Christian background, thinks, please let the minister say something about Jesus. And the husband, from a Jewish background, thinks, please, God, don't let the minister mention Jesus. And thus the dilemma of the preacher. There is that old joke about UUs and Easter, that our theme is upsy daisy. Let's just focus on nature and forget about Jesus. He makes us nervous. And yet, Jesus is hard to ignore on Easter. It feels somehow incomplete if we focus only on the springing flowers and green blades rising. Max Coots, a longtime UU minister in Canton, New York, wrote, and I quote, "We need the sense of deity to crack our own hard, brown December husk and push life out of inner tombs and outer pain. Unless we move the seasons of the self and spring can come for us, the winter will go on, and Easter will remain a myth, and life will never come again, despite the fact of spring." We need to know more than that every year some April comes and leaves a flowering shrub and warms the rain, or that old men thought that old gods rose again. But what is it that we need to know? What is it that we need to do in order for our own spirits to rise with the spring? All around us today, Christians are singing, "Christ the Lord is risen today," instead of, "Lo, the earth awakes again." Peter Berger coined the phrase, "the social construction of reality," which gives us insight into why Jesus makes us nervous. It's hard not to believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus when all around us, other people seem to. Spring brings allergies. One of our foundational UU principles is using reason to ascertain truth. Our Trinity from our Unitarian forebears is reason, freedom, and tolerance. Linda writes, "I don't think they are enough, but they are a great beginning and elements of our faith that we do not want to give up." So we ask, did these things really happen? Did Moses really climb a mountain and come down with tablets of stone? Did the waters of the Red Sea really part so that the Hebrews could pass over and then close so that the pursuing Egyptian soldiers would drown? Did Jesus literally rise from the dead? Linda's answer, and she writes, "My deepest, truest answer is probably not, not in a literal, scientific, historical sense, but I do want to leave that door open for myself and others. Linda goes on. I sometimes play with the idea of God as the sum total of all energy in the universe. And from that view, anything seems possible, even that God became human in the form of Jesus, even life after death. So my mind toggles between these positions. Did Jesus literally rise from the dead? No, that seems too fantastic. Seems like something we projected back onto him. And then there's the other side. But maybe he did. Maybe out of all those possibilities in the world, God experimented and took on human form. But the question of literal scientific truth may not be the most important question. Joseph Campbell noted in The Power of Myth that the Western religions, unlike the religions of the East, ask us to believe literally in the myths. Hinduism, in contrast, invites us to enter the stories, to ask how they are like our lives, what they call forth in us, how participating in the rituals based on them can help us live more fulfilling lives. But the Hindus don't ask that we believe literally. It's a different approach. The religious stories and rituals are more like tools which point beyond themselves, beyond ourselves, to what lies beyond the temporal. So, what shall we do with Jesus? Not just on Easter, but in general. Should we totally ignore him, just never go there? Or are there some gems in this story that can enhance our own spiritual journeys, our own living? One approach is to realize that there are different kinds and uses of truth. Because of the insights of postmodernism, as the young would say, truth is morphing. Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman have written about the social construction of reality and how what seems true to us depends greatly on what we are taught about the social structure in which we live and the institutions which perpetuate themselves with certain truths. For instance, one truth that our country teaches is that democracy is the best form of government. In fact, we're so sure of that truth that we think we should impose it on every country around the world. And postmodernism tells that the truth we perceive depends on the perspective from which we look. And yet, as one of my beloved parishioners, the late George Kerouac, cosmologist, used to say, and she quotes, "The scientific method is still the best means of ascertaining truth about the material world." But what about the non-material world? What about our souls and spirits and our interpersonal relationships, not only with other humans, but with all of life on our planet? What about the way societies are organized and their institutions maintained? These are more in the realm of aspiration and ideology and psychology and mythology. Here, the scientific method is not enough. I believe, Linda says, that science should inform our spirituality, but it is not enough for the qualitative aspects of life. Science tells us what, when, and sometimes how, but it rarely, maybe never, is enough for why and should and want to. The story of Jesus is the foundational myth of Christian culture. That is why the story is revisited each year by Christians at Christmas and Easter. Some of us are allergic to Christianity, perhaps because we were personally injured by it in some way. And some are allergic because of tensions with a Jewish heritage. But we can heal those allergies and mine the Christian tradition for wisdom and comfort, just as we mine the other world religions for what helps us to lead good lives. Our modern scientific minds balk when we're asked to believe literally in Moses climbing the mountain and descending with tablets of stone on which God wrote 10 commandments, or parting the Red Sea so that the Hebrews could cross over and then closing again so that pursuing Egyptian soldiers would drown, or Jesus dying on a cross, being buried in a tomb, then 3 days later getting up, walking out of the tomb, walking through walls, eating fish, and eventually rising skyward into heaven. And yet, the story of Moses and the 10 Commandments tells us something very important about the need for rules, for regulation of behavior, if we are to have viable community. And the story of Exodus tells us something very important about the cost and value of freedom. And the story of Jesus can tell us something very important about what happens to our own souls when life crucifies us. It is very clear that the roots of Unitarian Universalism are in Christianity. In Europe and in this country, we grew out of the most liberal, most Protestant wing of Christianity. Our ancestors clearly saw themselves as Christians. To reject Christianity or Judaism is to reject our roots. And just like cut flowers will quickly wilt and die, we too are more fragile when cut off from our roots. One of the important milestones in the evolution of our thinking about Jesus and Christianity was Theodore Parker's famous sermon in 1841 entitled On the Transient and Permanent in Christianity. This sermon earned him the label of heretic. For not only did he question the literalness of the miracles of Jesus, thus calling into question Jesus' authority as the Son of God, but also he declared that the truths of Christianity would have existed whether or not Jesus had ever lived. And what were those truths? Absolute, this is a quote from Parker, absolute pure morality, the love of man, the love of God acting without let or hindrance, end quote. To Theodore Parker, liberal Christian, we owe much of the grounding of our commitment today to social justice. His liberal Christianity led him to fight slavery to the extent that he wrote sermons with a pistol on his desk, afraid that the pro-slavery forces might kill him. He was vilified by his fellow Unitarian ministers who refused to exchange pulpits with him. And yet, today, he is one of our heroes. For Parker, the only creed was, there is one God. Linda wrote, I would probably have felt very at home with him, for that is my intuition, the grounding of my life. There is one God. When we pull back the telescope and read about ancient rituals of burying fertility gods in the earth to help the crops grow as the gods rise again in the spring, I think, aha, the similarities of those stories to the story of Jesus are a clue that something is going on here other than Jesus literally rising from the dead. We humans have always appealed to the gods, the larger forces, when we reach the limits of our capabilities. We can plant our crops, we can water them, irrigate them, but we cannot make them grow. For that, we are still dependent on the larger forces which create, sustain, destroy, and create new life. So while I don't believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus from the dead, because it is contrary to all my experience of other life around me, I still value the story for several reasons. She goes on. First, I value it for the example of love that Jesus provided. He constantly turned social classes upside down, valuing tax collectors and prostitutes, when the social conventions of the day said such people were to be detested, cast out of society. Instead, Jesus dined with them, lodged with them, marched with them, and taught them. He loved them. The story of Jesus' sacrificial love of giving his life in defiance of an oppressive, hateful Roman occupation is a clue to a fulfilling life. It tells us that the most important thing we can do is to love one another. Next, I value his story for the model it offers us of the human psyche. Life does crucify us. I wanted to die myself after watching my brother die, Linda wrote. It was the new life of my then toddler son that kept me from following my brother into the grave. We have a photo of my son as a toddler, taken in the yard of his grandparents in Great Barrington. He's reaching out, looking closely at a blooming sunflower. That picture comforted me at a very dark time, a time of incredible grief. It changed my focus, reminded me, life goes on. There is new life beyond this individual death. Embrace, she said to herself, embrace that larger life, the great cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The larger cycle of life does not end. It only changes form. Your soul will thrive when it opens its focus to that larger life. The story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection is a reminder of that truth. Dan Budd, UU minister in Buffalo for many years, once said that we UUs like to go to Easter without passing through Good Friday. We want Easter without suffering and death. His comment reminds me of the Buddhist practice of confronting death by lying in one's own coffin, sort of practicing death. Similarly, the periodic revisiting of the story of Jesus' death forces us to confront the fact of our own death. And yet, that story can also help us make that leap from our individual life and death to the larger cycle of life and death. In a sense, it is a way of transcending death, finding comfort in the face of our individual deaths. The story of Jesus' life also gives me hope for transformation, hope that I can become better than I am. For people who struggle with addiction or depression or post-traumatic stress or even physical ailments, the story can be a source of hope because it says there is life beyond the seeming death of these challenges. Reverend Lynn Unger wrote, "For me, the Easter story is about how Jesus transformed from a man who walked and ate and talked with people into something that couldn't be killed. a set of ideas about how we should treat all people with love and respect, how we should care for those who are poor or hurting, give kindness when we want to take revenge, and love our neighbor as we love ourselves, even if our neighbors don't look or sound or act the way we think they should. The man who taught these things was transformed into the teachings themselves, something that his companions could take, something that his companions could take out into the world to share. Set of values. In the same way that Buddhists take refuge in the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, Christians take refuge in the teachings of Christ. His followers often speak of the way. Isn't it wonderful to be a Unitarian Universalist and be able to embrace and take advantage of both sets of teaching? One of the things which distinguished our Unitarian ancestors from Christendom was our belief in the full humanity of Jesus. When the doctrine of the Trinity began to be developed in the 4th century, our ancestors resisted the deification of Jesus. They saw deifying Jesus as going backward, as slipping back toward polytheism. So, down through the ages, Unitarians were people who resisted seeing Jesus as the unique and only incarnation of God. On our Universalist side, we resisted what is known as the doctrine of atonement, the idea that Jesus' crucifixion was required by God as a sacrificial payment for our sins. Instead, said Hosea Ballou, no loving God would ever require such a sacrifice. So Linda continues, I find it very interesting now that within Christianity, we are hearing the same ideas. In Constantine's Sword, James Carroll, a former Roman Catholic priest, objects to the doctrine of atonement on grounds similar to those extolled by our Universalist ancestors. And Rob Bell, a Christian pastor, wrote a book called Love Wins, in which he also refuted the doctrine of atonement and affirmed the idea of universal salvation, that all will be ultimately reconciled with a God of love. Other voices in Christianity are also backing away from the literalism of the story. Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar urge us to look at the story of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, not as history, but as parable. Parables, they say, offer a different kind of truth, different from historical or factual truth. When we think of a parable, they say, such as, for instance, the story of the Good Samaritan, it is not important whether there actually lived a certain Samaritan who passed by a man injured and lying in a ditch on a certain day. We are not interested in parables primarily for their factual truth. Instead, the parable is important for the kind of truth that enables us to live good and fulfilling lives. Parables are important for the questions they raise. In the case of the Good Samaritan, the parabolic question is, what does it mean to be a good neighbor? And Jesus' answer to that question is, one is a good neighbor only if one considers all of humanity to be worthy of our concern and compassion. It may be, say Borg and Crossan, that the most important truths can be expressed only in parable. We are convinced that asking about the parabolic meaning of biblical stories, including the Easter stories, is always the most important question. The alternative of fixating on whether it happened this way or that almost always leads one astray. So, if we are to approach the Easter story in that way, not as literal truth, but as parable, What questions might we ask? What questions must we ask? And what truths might we uncover? Surely most of us know the outline of the story, but I'll review them just in case. Jesus introduced into the world of first century Palestine radical ideas about tearing down class and tribal and governmental structures and boundaries which oppressed the people of his time, especially the Jews of Palestine, who were being ruled by Roman conquerors. Because Jesus was considered dangerous by the Roman authorities, he, like many others, was considered seditious. He was put to death in a very cruel way, nailed to a cross. And yet, something strange and wonderful happened. Instead of that being the end of it, instead of never being heard of again, Jesus and his powerful ideas of equality and compassion and justice lived on in the hearts of his followers and have continued to do so down through the ages. So the Easter story is a powerful story of resurrection and rebirth and renewal, both in nature and in ourselves. These stories, which we repeat year after year, stories like Christmas and Easter and Passover, are replete with symbols and truths operating on many levels. That is why they have the power to last, because we can mine them for truth from many different perspectives and on many levels. Prior to the story of Jesus' life and death and resurrection, humans had for thousands of years celebrated the return of spring. In many ways, the stories of spring and of Jesus coincide. It is easy to conflate them in our minds and our psyches, because both ask many questions of us having to do with life and death, such as, what powers of domination are keeping us from opening to new possibilities? Will we give in to despair? Or will we believe that there is a power in the universe which is on the side of goodness? And if we will open ourselves to it, can it assist us in moving toward new life? Will winter and death win in nature or our souls? Will goodness ultimately triumph over evil? What will it take to crack our hard, brown December husks and push life out of inner tombs and outer pain? Sometimes, when we are feeling entombed, trapped by whatever seems oppressive to us, we need a sense of help from outside ourselves. We need the help of something larger than ourselves. Perhaps it is our family, or a good therapist, or a community such as this one, or the source of life itself. We need the grace of the universe, of everything going our way, of the snowmelt and the sap rising, to realize that we are no longer trapped. We are free. We can rise from the slough of despond. Though the Gospels differ considerably in their counts of Easter Sunday, one detail which is consistent throughout is that someone other than Jesus rolled away that stone. In the oldest account, that of Mark, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, ask one another as they make their way to the tomb, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the door of the tomb?" And when they arrive, they are astonished to realize that someone else has already rolled away the door of the tomb. Sometimes we can roll away the door of the tomb for ourselves, and sometimes we need the help of others. Sometimes help comes through other human beings known or unknown, and sometimes through seeming angels, as in Matthew, and sometimes through a spirit at large which remains mysterious. Faith says, one way or another, the door will be rolled away, and we will, like the new life emerging all around us in nature, be able to walk from the tomb, transformed, newly able to celebrate the life which is before us. May our spirits rise once again this Easter season. Let us be together in silent consideration of Reverend Linda's message. In the tomb of the soul, we carry secret yearnings, pains, frustrations, loneliness, fears, regrets, worries.
In the tomb of the soul, we take refuge from the world and its heaviness.
In the tomb of the soul, we wrap ourselves in the security of darkness.
Sometimes this is a comfort. Sometimes it is an escape.
Sometimes it prepares us for experience. Sometimes it insulates us from life.
Sometimes this tomb life gives us time to feel the pain of the world and reach out to heal others. Sometimes it numbs us and locks us up with our own concerns.
In this season where light and dark balance the day, we seek balance for ourselves.
Grateful for the darkness that has nourished us, we push away the stone and invite the light to awaken us to the possibilities within us and among us. Possibilities for a new life in ourselves and in the world.
Today we honor the light and the wounds, the passion of the heart and the blue, true dream of sky, the weeping at night and the joy in the morning, the wisdom of life that abides, to love all fragile things. Long after our flesh perishes as the grass, life and love and change and new life shall bless, shall bless, shall bless. These words from the Reverend Bruce Southworth. Read it, do it.
Okay. Join us in the words in your order of service for extinguishing the chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Please join us in coffee hour. Here's cake. This concludes our service. Thank you for being here.